just takes a few seconds. I think we might be live, but I'm going to give it a few seconds. For those of you who are here, hello, welcome. We're going to give it 10 to 20 more seconds to settle in. Bear with us. All right. Welcome, everyone. It's so good I can't see you, but it's good that you are joining us. Thank you for joining us this Sunday afternoon at 6 p.m. Pacific. Hi, Dustin. Good to see you. It's been a while. Glad you're here with us. Hi, everyone else. I am Ella, and today I am joined by Asha Lorray, who is our new co-director. Thank you for joining us, Ash.
Thank you for having me. Excited.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I forgot to introduce who we are. So we are the Consent Academy. The Consent Academy is an educational collective based out of Seattle, Washington. And Asha and I both work/volunteer with the Consent Academy. And the Consent Academy's mission is to teach about consent in all of its aspects and complexity and potential. And so, we decided a few months ago to come on here on Twitch and just chat about consent every Sunday. Because why not, right? Let's try something new. It's all about building consent culture. So this is just another avenue we're trying. And like I said, today I'm joined by Asha Lorray, who is the new co-director of the Consent Academy. And Asha, or Ash, has been a part of the Consent Academy since 2018, 4 years now. Woo. She's been teaching established curriculum, creating new workshops, leading discussion groups, acting as a consent advocate and consultant. She's done a whole bunch of things with the Consent Academy, and she's passionate about consent education as a way to reduce trauma, promote pleasure and eroticism, support accountability, and foster cultural change that balances autonomy with responsibility. Love it. Asha is also an Anti-UP certified sexuality, gender, and justice educator. She's also a somatic sex educator, certified yoga teacher, certified abortion doula, and domestic violence support group facilitator. Woo! So she's badass, and you better not mess with her, basically. Welcome again, Ash. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you again for having me, and my cat Anastasia, who will make her presence known at some point, I'm sure.
We love it. We love cats. We're cat people here. So Ash, I guess I would like to start by asking you how you define consent, right? For I know some folks who are listening in kind of have been following us for a while, but some folks might be new to this whole consent conversation. So how do you define consent?
Great question. So I started off like most people, thinking about consent in terms of sex, thinking about it in terms of yes and no, thinking that there were like logical rules to consent, and also that they were not super clear in a lot of complicated situations. And so you kind of just had to rely on general cultural norms of like being a good person. And like, that's what consent was, is like behaving in a way that made you a good person. And then I started to learn more about consent, and I came across the etymology of the word. And so I'm big into etymology, like the origins of where words come from. And consent comes from Latin. It comes from the Latin word consentire. I probably am always butchering that. I don't know Latin. But the root con means with or together, and sentire means to sense or to feel. And so you put that together, and it means to feel together, or to feel with, or to do something with feeling. And that's how I define consent now. Like, consent is that feeling and sensation and alignment in your body, that I want to go along with this. I want this. And that requires like a lot of awareness of yourself, a lot of self-reflection, and like a kind of willingness to have things be up in the air a little bit and to constantly review them. It's not so much logical rules and yes and no, just relying on that. It's a lot more subtle than that.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's probably how I define consent.
That reminds me of one thing you said one time in class, which was consent cannot be approached linearly.
Mhm.
Can you explain a little bit what you mean by that? I mean, you started to, right? You were talking about how like it's about sensation, but yeah, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that a little bit
Yeah, so you might think that consent is like, I show up, I have a desire, another person shows up, they have a desire. We negotiate those desires, we do the thing or we don't do the thing, and then it's all good. And like, we can't bring it up again because we consented in that moment, it's
more.
over, like kind of a linear progression. That's really not how it actually goes. First of all, your desires are complex. Where did they come from? How are you fully aware of them? Are they really yours? Like different
Mm,
cultural pressure, history in your life, all of those things. You kind of do a reflective process on those desires of like, am I actually going to bring this up to somebody? Is this something that's just within myself?
mm,
Um, so there's kind of like a circular process going on there just around desire for every person. And like that's also related to their community. It goes outward. And I would
mm,
also say like back into history and time and like your ancestors, but like we'll keep it a little more simple. So within your own body, there's this complex process going on. And then when you meet somebody, you now have to negotiate those desires. And that might look like, oh, we have a conversation, we talk about risks, we make an agreement. But then as things are happening, if you're staying in touch with that complex system going on in your own body, you might say, whoa, we need to take a step back. We need to pause. I'm not quite sure if I'm into this. Let's review. Maybe wait till next time. Or I want more intensity. And that person's like, I don't know if that's a good idea. So, like, maybe trying to jump ahead a little bit. There's all sorts of possibilities.
mm,
And then after whatever that interaction was, not just in sex, there's the chance to review that. And you might review that over years in your life and think about it differently every time.
mm,
And that's normal.
mm.
That's normal with consent. Like it's a little complicated and scary that it can be that complicated. But like that's part of why I'm into consent work is like I want to normalize that and make it less scary.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, kind of like that notion that consent is inherently gray, right? Like
Mhm.
we talk about, no means no, right? And that's great, right? Empowering people to say no and then kind of the enthusiastic yes, right? Looking for that. But I remember one time you were like, I mean, sometimes I consent to something, but I'm not enthusiastic about it. Like,
Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
I consent to, I don't know, going to
Cleaning my cat's litter box.
right, exactly. Going to the gym. Ooh, all right. I consent to it, but I'm not super enthusiastic about it. So being okay with that grayness, right? That's a big part of consent. Um, Speaking of kind of some of the things that, you know, you have taught folks over the years in the Consent Academy around consent, some of it is that like consent and its inherent grayness and kind of also the somatic or bodily aspect of consent. And there are many other classes that you have taught with the Consent Academy. What's your favorite one?
Um, yeah, I really liked teaching about the inherent grayness of consent.
Mm,
I called that class Blurred Lines and talked about the song because we've had quite a cultural shift already around how we think about consent. Because like that song came out and like some people were really upset about it and how it was pretty like pushing these narratives of like I know what you want, I can make these decisions for you, and then a couple of years later, the creators of the song were like, "Oh no, that was not cool." um, so that one was fun. But I think my favorite class that I've taught for Consent Academy is on trauma responses.
mm,
Um, that is like a big part of consent. People are having stress and trauma responses. That's something for people to understand. Like people think trauma is like really intense, and it can be, but like it's on trauma is an extreme kind of stress.
mm,
So everybody has stress responses. They're like mini versions of trauma responses. And that affects how they consent. Like you mentioned the enthusiasm piece before. There's a really common stress and trauma response around fawning or like people pleasing
Mm.
and like just pretending everything's okay and going along with it and being compliant. So I like to like get into the nitty gritty of what those things can look like, from just
Mhm.
like that mild stress response all the way up to an acute stress response, a trauma response,
Mhm.
and normalizing that for people. And then also talking about like the ways that they show up in our culture in general. Like,
Mhm.
for instance, with a fight response, like what triggers that in your body or what that would look like. There's increased heart rate, increased muscle tension. It often comes out in like clenching your fists. And
Mhm.
so if you're at a protest or if you're at a sports game, you're doing the things that are leading your body to think, oh, we're fighting. And
Mm.
then people wonder why those parts of our culture can have a lot of violence around them. And I'm like, if we
Mm.
had a trauma informed lens, it would make sense. So yeah, I really like teaching that class. That was fun.
So I want to ask you more about this because this is fascinating. So
Mhm.
you've taught about trauma responses in the context of consent. Why is that important? So what you're saying, if we all had a trauma informed lens, we'd be better off. What does that have to do with consent?
Mhm. So there's the self reflection piece. It's like if you learn about trauma responses, the first thing I ask people to do is to start becoming more aware of how it shows up in your body. And that way you can talk about it with other people and give them some informed consent on dealing with you.
Hmm.
Of like, when I get triggered or when I'm in a stressful situation, I I'm most likely to go into fight. And for me, that looks like snapping at you. That looks like stiffening my body and like um, being able to explain that to somebody so that they can check in at that point and be like, hey, I'm noticing these things you talked about before. Is that maybe going on?
Hmm.
And then also being able to um, negotiate around that. But like, oh, I think a lot of consent violations happen when somebody is having a trauma response and they might feel shame, they might not know what's happening,
Hmm.
and they don't say anything in the moment and they come back later and are like, you should have been able to tell. Um, you can negotiate for that ahead of time of like, I don't know that this might happen, but like it's possible. Is
Hmm.
that something that you are willing and able to deal with?
Hmm.
Like, yeah, not everybody has practice dealing with trauma.
Right.
So you should be able to choose.
Right. And that kind of leads me to a question I wanted to ask in the beginning that I forgot,
Sure.
which is, I kind of touched on this in your intro, but I'd like to know like exactly, or more concretely, what your consent ethos is. So like ethos meaning, I don't exactly know what it means, but kind of like your philosophy or your truth about consent, right? Is that how you would define it?
Yeah. I was just teaching in a class yesterday where we defined it for people, so I have it stuck in my head. It's like the underlying spirit or character of
Mm.
a group, like the sentiments that lead people to have like these dominant assumptions about how things should be run.
Mm.
And so my ethos around consent is like really based in non-dualism.
Mm.
So not really being really attached to
Mm.
binaries of right and wrong, yes and no, victim and perpetrator, um, holding that middle space, like we've already talked about the inherent grayness, and like pointing out when that binary bias is starting to sneak in.
Mm.
Um, so I'm not really concerned when people are, whether people are good or bad people. Like
Mm.
I'm looking at that moment to moment negotiation with behavior. That's my
Mm.
ethos around consent. And I
Mm.
call that like my praxis. Praxis is the combination of theory, so like the things that you logically know about consent,
Mhm.
and then practice, the things that you actually put into action and been like, okay, that's how it actually goes. And you update your theory and they combine together to make praxis, which is your unique way of relating in the world and
Mhm.
relating consensually, addressing non-consent.
Mhm.
So mine is non-dualist, I would say, and then also based in the body, which I
Mm.
think is also a non-dual experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so, going along a little bit with this kind of not you say non-dualism, but I kind of asked you what's your favorite class. I want to know the opposite too. I want to know like maybe not your least favorite class, just a little bit different. Like, what are some challenges about being a consent educator? Right? You've been an educator and slash advocate consultant for 4 years now, and now you're in a leadership position within the organization. What's most challenging to you, or what are some challenging things about teaching consent?
Hmm. Oh, that's a really good question. So there's so many things that come to mind. Um, I think the first one is we need more people to do this work.
Mm.
And that means that people need to not, we need to be better at like spreading this ethos of you don't have to be a perfect person in order to teach about consent. Like I
Mm.
violated consent before. So that's another challenge of people assuming that I never have.
Mm.
But I violated consent before. I probably will again in my life. It's something that you really can't avoid.
Mm.
And so if you have before, that doesn't disqualify you from being a consent educator. Like I think many people have something important to say about consent, and I want them to volunteer with us. So that's a challenge. Another one is the people that often come to our classes are the people that already think consent is important. And
Mm.
so how do I get the people in the room that don't think it's important? And like we can non-consensually show up to places. That has happened before where like a company is like, we need this training and it's required for everybody. And so they all have to come and they don't want to be there. And that's not great. That's not a great learning environment.
Mhm.
So how do we get people consensually in the room that really, really need this education? That's a big challenge.
Mhm.
And I think another one would be um, often the people that we were teaching that lean towards being on the whiter end. We're based in Seattle, Washington.
Mm.
And I'm Black and white myself. And I want to teach more people of color. And I want to not like very frequently be one of the very few people of color in the room, because a part of my passion for consent work is based in like my own history of like I see autonomy as the foundation of consent, autonomy being your inherent right to decide for yourself what's best for your own body, mind, spirit. And like that right has been limited to certain people in the US's history and world history. But that right existed. And like that's a part of why I am so passionate about that. I feel like people in my ancestral line did not have the freedom to express that autonomy and live lives that were consensual and that they wanted. Yeah, and I want to share that more openly with people without, yeah.
Right, without being the only person in the room who's trying to, educate all these people about this kind of very hurtful history, right? That was kind of imposed upon
Mm-hmm.
many of your ancestors and other ancestors of people of color, and the legacy of that violence is going on today, right?
Exactly.
Where do you even begin to explain that? Sometimes, when you're in a room full of people who aren't aware of that. So I hear you.
I just casually drop it and then keep going. Just like, yeah, okay, deal with those feelings and we'll keep talking.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
What about, so I'm curious, you've been educating for 4 years now, and there's some things that you really enjoy and that are passionate, and then other very challenging aspects about doing this work. So what made you want to become a co-director?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, like, so how I got into doing the consent work in the beginning was I was doing a support group for survivors of domestic violence, and I still do that. I still volunteer my time. And I grew up in a house myself with domestic violence, been in relationships before that were not great. And when I was in that group, I was like, wow, abuse is a pattern of consent violations. And not having consent education is a part of why people don't see the red flags. It's a part of why I think even all the way up to our legal system, why they don't recognize all different kinds of abuse, and they're pretty focused on just physical and sexual abuse. So I was like, is anybody teaching about consent? And so I Googled Consent Seattle, and Consent Academy came up, and I'm forever grateful. And I haven't found many other organizations that do teach about consent, specifically in this frame of like not just focused on sex, not just focused on violence prevention and abuse prevention, but also consent is just a way to like have better experiences in your life, in your workplace, in your home, and not just in your sex life. Um, so wanting to become a co-director was wanting to bring that message to more people,
Mhm.
and to expand our brand. The Consent Academy is based in Seattle, Washington, based in the sex positive and like kink community here. And we really want to build upon that legacy and then also get in wherever we can get in. We want to
Mhm.
get into offices, we want to get into schools, we want to get into spiritual communities. We want to get in wherever we can because this message really like culture change takes a lot of people being on the same page about things. And we want to create a world that has a consent culture instead of a rape culture that we live in right now. So that's why I wanted to be co-director. Yeah, this is the work I'm most passionate about.
Nice. Thank you for sharing. You're going to be a wonderful co-director.
I hope.
Yes, no doubt. And we're 20 minutes in. I do want to kind of pause and welcome any new people who might have joined our stream. Hello, welcome. We are the Consent Academy. I'm Ella, and I'm here with Asha Lorraine, or Ash. And we're over here talking about kind of the journey of Ash from becoming, someone who started volunteering at the Consent Academy and now who is in the capacity of co-director. And we're talking about what we love about consent. And we're the Consent Academy, which is a nonprofit educational collective based out of Seattle, Washington. So that's us, and welcome. We're so glad you're here. If you have any questions, comments, anything goofy, silly, interesting, write them in the chat. We want to hear from you. We will answer your questions if we can to the best of our abilities. So yeah, feel free to engage in the chat. We would love that. Back to our interview. I want to ask you more about kind of what a little bit more about your goals as co-director. And you're one co-director, right? There's another, Ariana,
Mhm.
right? And she is in Austria, is that right?
Yeah.
Right. So right now it's in the middle of the night for her, so we couldn't she couldn't join us. But I do want to ask you a little bit more about that, and kind of the future of the Consent Academy. But I kind of want to backtrack, and I want to talk more about just consent, because you and I are pretty big consent nerds, and we've had many conversations about consent. And I just have a bunch written down here, and I kind of want to go back and revisit some of those, and just kind of talk about them a little more. How does that sound?
Let's do it.
Cool. So I remember one time we started talking about consent as magic. Do you remember that?
I do.
Okay, just some background. I'm like lately been very into like exploring what magic and mysticism and all these like woo-woo things, but I don't know why I'm just very attracted to that stuff. And when you said, oh, consent is magic to me, I was like, wait, what? Hold on, let's talk about this. So yeah, let's pretend like we're back in that conversation.
Mhm.
How do tell me more. Consent is magic. What do you mean by
Okay. Let me try and remember all the brilliant thoughts I had.
that? Well, I remember you were talking about like, about words,
Mhm.
and the power of words. So it was in that vein a little bit. Do you remember?
I do. So, yeah, I'm a firm believer that language is magic,
Mm,
that we speak things into existence all the time. And like just sitting here, the words that I am speaking is having like a physical effect on your body,
mm,
like watching my mouth move and like the actual sound waves hitting your ear. Like it's magical. It's a fantastic, magical thing to be human and be alive. And language, especially, is like spells all the time.
mm,
And so consent is like when you when you cast a spell and like it's successful is kind of how I think about it. Of like two people speak something into existence, or and like verbally or non-verbally,
Mhm.
like body language, also a thing. And when their feelings and intentions and sensations are aligned, like I think you create something extra that wasn't there before. Um, and that's consent. It's magic.
I love that. I love that. I've been thinking about magic in that way too, of kind of, I've been thinking it in terms of love, like love as magic.
Mhm.
And consent to me is a form of love. So that totally resonates. Can you think of like a moment in your life where you felt like, that happened? I mean, I know consent is and not consent or happening constantly, right? But can you think of an example where you're like, yes, this feels magical that happened, I don't know, recently or something?
Well, I think like a part of why I decided to be co-director was
Mhm.
Ariana pitched to me like our vision of what it could be like. And I was like, yes, I am so into this idea. Like, I'm not really into being in positions of power. Like, that's
Mm,
something that I generally shy away from. Um, but the vision that she presented to me of like what we could do at
mm,
the Consent Academy, that was one of those magical moments for me. I was like, I am so in line and in tune with that, and specifically with her. I
mm,
wouldn't want to do this with anybody else.
mhm, mhm. Totally. I love that. What about like, let's talk a little bit about consent in like popular culture, or like popular
Mhm.
media. We've talked a lot about that too. And I remember, I don't know if those of you who are watching, if you all are familiar with the show, um, I May Destroy You. But that show is a legendary show on HBO that Ash and I really like.
Mhm.
And, we've kind of watched it through, obviously, like our consent nerd, eyes. Um, let's see, this is hard to give a synopsis of I May Destroy You, but,
Mhm.
you know, what are some elements in popular culture, including in this show, that some elements of consent that you've been seeing, or that are lacking, these days, including in that show? What are you seeing from like a pop culture perspective?
Mhm. So there's a lot of like that binary view of consent, of like, yeah, people have this idea. Oh man, okay, let's see where to start. Um, yeah, people have this idea that yes and no are like the big words for one. So like if somebody doesn't say no, they can't think that it was non-consensual. Like they needed to say something in the moment. And that's just not true. And I think our culture is starting to like show more depictions of that, of like all the ways in which that can happen. Um, and then we also have this like linear narrative of like, okay, so if somebody does something wrong, we have a criminal justice system and they're going to handle it, and like, and that's going to make you feel better.
Mm,
And that's not the story either,
mm,
like for most people. um, and then this idea of like a perfect victim and how they're supposed to behave, like there's just so many ideas around that. Like you can't watch true crime shows without that coming out of like, this is what a victim is supposed to act, and like,
mm,
and if they didn't act like that, that's suspicious, super suspicious.
mm.
um and that's just not true. Like once you've experienced trauma, like you're going to behave in traumatized ways, and that might include being non-consensual to other people. Like
Ooh, okay. Yeah.
that's
I
that's
feel
a
like
thing.
we need to repeat that for everyone. So this is a very important part of consent education, where I was like, aha, the binary of victim and perpetrator is often just like not realistic, and just not true, right? And sometimes you might have been traumatized by someone, or some event, and then you yourself start behaving in non-consensual ways, in large part because of that trauma that's unresolved. So I just wanted to repeat that for everyone who's watching. It's
Mhm.
important. Anyway.
It's very normal to be both a victim and a perpetrator. It's very normal.
Mhm.
Like, and we don't create enough space for that in our culture. You have to be one or the other. They have specific ways of behaving, and like they really perpetuate like racist ideas and like sexist ideas of what a victim should look like and the victims we should care about. And who we assume to automatically be a perpetrator and be a bad person.
Right.
Yeah, screw all of that.
I feel like that gets in the way of consent, and not just the way of consent, but also in the way of like, okay, so we hurt someone. Typically, we don't hurt people on purpose, right? We hurt them and we're like, oh man, I didn't realize I was hurting you. And so then this binary of victim and perpetrator and other binaries get in the way of like resolving that, right?
Mhm, mhm.
Like,
Yeah, a part of my ethos is like, with the non-dualism, it's kind of like getting out of the way of people. Like, get the people out of the way and what's the actual impact of what has happened, and like focus on that. And so people will often think like, oh, something bad has happened, we need to listen to the person who it happened to, they know the right way to handle it. And I'm like, they are probably the person with the least amount of capacity to figure out how to handle this because they're suffering. Like,
mm,
that impact was the closest to them. Like, if it
mhm,
was a bomb that blew up, they were like right there. Why are you going to them and asking them like, what needs to happen now? Tell us all what to do. Like, support that person, help them recover before you start asking things like that. Let
mm,
them fantasize for sure.
mm,
And like, people will often fantasize about vengeance. And like, that's fine and normal. And you can validate that all those feelings are normal. But like, having them run an accountability process right away. Like, I don't know where we got these ideas.
mm,
So yeah, like focusing on that impact, what made that happen? And it goes back into that not so linear process of like, what's the culture? What's the history in this community? What's the history in these people's families and bloodlines? Like, what has led up to this moment of this happening?
mhm,
Um, yeah, and it takes the pressure, I think, off of the person who is accused of the harm or responsible for the harm
mm,
to like solve it right away, when it's like they need to do a ton of self-reflection. They need to do a ton of that to like figure out why, where did these desires come from? Why did I behave in that way?
mhm,
And can I own that behavior? And what do I need to do to make sure that that doesn't happen again?
mhm.
As opposed to just being labeled a bad person immediately and tossed aside out of your community with no resources to then do that work.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm passionate about this.
Yeah, I mean, I am too. I absolutely am too. I mean, lately I've been thinking a lot about consent and kind of the punitive ways in which we deal with, people who cause harm, like how that gets in the way of building consent culture.
Mhm, mhm. Like, it is nuanced. I understand why people use tactics that might be viewed as punitive, like call outs and things like that. Um, but when we think about culture change, we
Mhm,
have to get out of the way of the people and think like in that systemic perspective.
mhm,
Um, and that's hard to do. I don't claim to be an expert on that. I am an educator. I'm educating on the how I think that this might work. And we've put some things into practice over the years. The Consent Academy has been around. And that's also another part of why we need more people. We want to learn from the practice that you've had. What's
mm,
gone wrong? What's gone right for you?
mhm.
Um, yeah, accountability is super messy, the way consent can be messy.
Right.
Um, so we need more perspectives, not this like dogma of here's the right way to go
Mm,
about it.
mhm. Are there any particular classes or, discussion groups the Consent Academy has right now? For those who are watching, right, who are wondering, well, okay, what is this whole consent and accountability and all this? So then if we don't put people in jail, then what do we do with them?
Mhm,
Um, are there any classes that you would recommend?
mhm. So, well, to make a distinction, we are not an organization that like practices transformative justice. And
Mhm.
like that is a specific term with a specific history and is really focused on changing the systems that lead to harm and crime occurring. And we are an educational organization. That is our role. We try to stay in our lane. So we do have classes coming up on consent accountability. We have a consent for and leadership series
Mm,
that has like the last four classes in that series. It just started and it goes all the way till June. So those last four classes are probably around in like May and June, I think.
mhm,
On what different types of accountability can look like, managing the consent incident from that leadership perspective. You're the person that's like, somebody told, okay, this thing has happened, you need to do something about it. Like, how do you do that?
Mm.
So we do have classes on that kind of thing. And we also have a lot of discussion groups that are free to attend. We just had one earlier today for men. We do one for people that identify as women, one for trans, non-binary, and genderqueer people, and then ones that are open to people of all genders, called Consent Chat, and also a Consent Q&A. So there's a lot of opportunities to just show up and be like, I got questions, and we will chat. We can hash it out.
Right. And again, like we're no experts, right? We're kind of bringing our lived experience and kind of the knowledge that we've built over the years around this, but really we're over here to just chat and, build those relationships of respect, right? Because consent for me is like kind of a fancy way of thinking of respect, fancier way of thinking of, respect actually means. So you can go on our website. It's www.consent.academy. And there you can find all of our upcoming workshops, resources, and so on. So feel free to go on there and learn more. And I do want to read a comment on the chat, Ash. It says, I've heard of consequence versus punishment in a related conversation. What would you say to that comment?
Yes, I like that comment. Thank you. Yeah, I think so. With consent, we have that foundation of it is our autonomy, that ability to decide what's best for yourself, and how you express that autonomy and negotiate it with other people is by consent. It's like, here's my autonomy bubble, here's your autonomy bubble. If we want to do anything that crosses those bubbles, we need to talk about it. We need to agree on it. And if you don't want something to happen, then you might set a boundary and you're like, no, here's my autonomy. I'm staying over here. Don't cross that boundary. And people are often like, well, once a boundary has been crossed, like kind of like the cultural view around it is you get to do something awful to that person in return. Like you get to make them feel the same pain that you've experienced. That's only fair. And that's a punishment in my perspective of saying like, I have this hurt and I want somebody else to feel the hurt. Punishment. A consequence is different. A consequence is what happens because that boundary was crossed. Like, so for example, like a boundary, you back them up with consequences. The only way that you can enforce a boundary without non-consensually crossing into somebody else's autonomy via punishment is usually by leaving that situation. Removing yourself from a relationship, removing yourself from that person's space, not giving them access to you anymore, blocking them, whatever that looks like. And like for a lot of orgs, they're like, okay, so then we ban people. I'm like, that's different from you leaving. Like, so that's a tricky thing to navigate there. It's not to say that like you should never ban people. We talk a lot about having a consent policy, which is like your informed consent up front, which is just tells people what the consequences are of their actions. So like, if these kinds of things happen, this is how we handle it. And people can agree to be in a space that handles things that way or not. But like, I think a really interesting thing that I've read about, there are tribes in Africa that have long practiced when there's somebody in their group that doesn't want to get along, that doesn't wants to power over other people, they pack up their whole village and leave that person in the middle of the night. And they just keep doing that if they show up. And I'm like, there's a lot of factors in our country and in the US that don't allow people to practice that way, but like interesting to think about, huh? Like, and that to me is like a consequence as opposed to punishment, as opposed to like exiling that person or confining them because they won't behave properly.
I do wonder about this whole punishment thing because at this point it feels almost like human nature. Like, and I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying, it's just kind of becomes so ingrained in our culture, right? If you hurt someone, especially, if you break the law, right? Law is like a whole nother conversation we can have, right? Because so law, the purpose of law, right? Like, is this, you know, one way to like codify consent? I don't know. But
Mhm.
really, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, well, you've messed up, you know, you got to be punished. Or even, like you said, sometimes you have that desire. You're like, well,
Mhm.
you fuck me up. Well, I want to fuck you up. So, and that's pretty natural. So then, so what do we do with this tension, right? Of like, it's okay to want to punish someone back, and, you know, it's okay to feel that way. And also that's non-consensual often, right? So where does that leave us then, as far as like if we want to continue practicing consent?
Mhm. Mhm. Like, I think the first thing is support. Everybody needs support. Like, you
Mm,
can't do this on your own. Um, like, our individual bodies aren't actually individual. Like, we're made up of all these like millions of microbes and all these other things. And like, no person can have that right to autonomy if somebody didn't take care of them, if we didn't have all this infrastructure that allowed us to live. Like, your autonomy comes with a responsibility to a community. And like, when something happens around consent, it shouldn't be all on those two people to figure it out. I
mm,
think you need support. And
mhm,
like, Consent Academy, we're here, we'll be support. Like, hit us up. um but so you talk to somebody else about it, and I think like that's a role I played a lot in my life of like, you can have those fantasies of vengeance and like talk about the feelings. That's important, that's an important part of it. And then when people have that space to do that, then they're like, what do you really want? They wanted that to never happen to them. And they usually want it to never happen to somebody else again.
mhm,
And I'm like, well, we can't make that have never happened to you. It has happened. And like, now it's your responsibility to heal. Like, nobody else can make that healing happen for you.
mhm,
Punishing that other person is not going to heal you. That's not how this works, unfortunately. And talking to other people that have been harmed, like, they can usually help you understand that, because it's hard in the when you're really hurting
mhm,
to understand that. So there's that. And then feeling like I want to make sure that that never happens again, that that person never behaves that way again. You can't do that unless you want to control them, unless you want to confine them or exile them, monitor their behavior, police them. And so, like, you can invest resources into that. That's what our society has done. And it's actually not super effective, is the other thing. It's really just not. Like, especially working with survivors who get like protection orders, they
mhm,
are very often not enforced. Like, that's the unfortunate reality. Um,
mhm,
so, how do you give that person who has caused harm, how do you make them feel responsible for changing that behavior and making sure it never happens again? Because they are the only one that can do that, ultimately, be responsible for themselves and their own behavior. And I think that means making it less scary for them to seek out help,
mhm,
for them to seek out support and somebody to help not monitor their behavior, but be accountable, somebody that they can be open with
mhm,
about their thoughts and desires. Like, often when you've harmed somebody, I've harmed people before, you want to feel powerful. Like, you want what you want and you don't think about what that might do to that other person.
mhm.
And so, like, how can you get that expressed in your life without powering over other people?
Right.
Yeah, that's a whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, this is fascinating. So you know, I know it's, you know, almost 6:45, and, you know, we've been talking for a while, and we've talked about all kinds of things at this point. But kind of to wrap this part a little bit. Um, Again, I just want to make a point that these feelings of and desires are all normal. So it's not like we're trying to stigmatize them, or, you know, say they're bad. Again, trying to stay away from good and bad when we talk about consent. Um, but I do think that just being like, okay, well, so they're emotions that we have and that they come out. So then where can we practice them safely? Right? What do those places look like? And you know, coming up with those kind of safe containers to, you know, practice these desires and feelings. So, like, for example, I'm thinking of kind of this desire that people have over powering others and winning, right? This is a real, very real desire of people. Um, So, that's why we have sports and games, right?
Mhm.
Like it's a safe kind of container. There's lines, there's refs, there's rules, you have to follow. And then at some point it ends and that's it. And it stays on the court and you're able to like win the game or, maybe it's a video game or whatever. But so it's very normal to have all of these desires and feelings, but finding kind of containers to do them safely is, I think, very important. Like that's why I want to tell some people, billionaires in our society, right? Like this is not a game. If you want to play a game, sign up for a rec league. Because these are people's lives, and like I feel like for a lot of these people who are, have so much power and wealth and control, it's just a game to them, and so that's why I just kind of want to be like, go play a damn sport. Um, so that's, it's something important, something to consider. But moving on, I kind of want to ask you a last question, that will kind of wrap up this whole thing. What are what are you looking forward to most as co-director of the Consent Academy? And like, you know, what what kind of legacy do you hope to leave
Legacy. Ooh, makes me
behind?
think about dying. How fun. That's okay. Um,
It doesn't have to be that way. Just, a legacy as just director. You won't be doing this forever.
I have no issues mulling over my own death. That's okay. um, but yeah, I'm excited to um, to talk about consent in more aspects to expand our education around consent.
Mhm.
Like, and not that like previously we weren't trying to do that, but just having like the ability to really focus in on that. And this is my job now to really focus in on that. Expand it to especially in the pleasure and eroticism area. Like I define eroticism as that feeling and sensation of being fully alive.
Mm.
And when we talk about consent, like some people will be like, oh, consent is sexy. And it's like, yes, but like I want to talk about consent being erotic.
Mm.
I want that to become more of what we talk about and something that gets people excited about it, having like art and lushness around the idea of consent, not just like like what are the visuals and images that come to mind. I want that. Like that's what I hope to be my legacy around it.
Yeah, love
That
that.
people think of the erotic when they think of consent.
Yay. I love that so much. I am going to read a comment in the chat. You have legacies when you retire too, or just move on from a position. That's right. Yes,
Yep.
exactly. um, we can't. I would love to talk about consent and death with you someday. We'll get
Yes.
to that.
Me too.
We have talked about this before, and have also had great conversations. So I think we should talk about that, uh, sometime in the future again.
Mhm.
But I think that this is a good place to end. What do you think, Cash?
That sounds good. Mhm.
Thank you so much, first of all, to Ash, right, for your time and your all of your years on consent education and advocacy and supporting survivors. You know, all of us are very, very grateful for you and for your work and time. So thank you. And also those of you who are watching, thank you for joining us. 10 people, let's go. It was great to be with you in spirit today. I hope you learned something new about consent or about the Consent Academy. And yes, thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Jeff, Dustin, Cool Arif, KR, Ellen, all of y'all. Thank you so much. Sar, yes, have a good night, everyone. We shall see you next Sunday at 6 p.m.
Bye.
Bye. Now I have to figure out how to get out of live. Hold on.
I was just about to leave, but we'll probably debrief.